My phone buzzed on the hotel balcony at 9:47 in the morning, and I almost didn't pick it up because Sarah and I had a rule for this trip to the Gulf Coast. No work, no neighborhood drama, just 6 days of doing absolutely nothing. But it buzzed 3 more times in under a minute, and that kind of urgency from my neighbor Dale usually meant a package got delivered to the wrong porch. I picked it up anyway. The first text just said, "Are you seeing this?" The second was a photo. I looked at it for maybe 2 full seconds before my brain refused to process what my eyes were sending it. There was an excavator parked where my living room used to be. Not next to my house, where my house used to be. I remember laughing, actually laughing, because the easiest explanation was that Dale had sent me the wrong photo, or it was some kind of joke about a house down the street that looked vaguely similar to mine from a weird angle. I texted back, "Wrong house, LOL," and he responded almost instantly with 4 more photos, and that's when the floor of my stomach dropped out completely. I recognized the stone facade I'd hand-picked from a quarry outside Marble Falls. I recognized the iron porch railings Sarah had insisted on from a custom fabricator in Bernie. I recognized the front door, lying flat in the dirt about 30 feet from where it should have been standing upright. My house, the one we'd spent 2 years designing and building on 4 acres outside a fast-growing community northwest of Austin, the one we'd poured $1.2 million and every ounce of patience we had into, was a pile of broken stone and twisted rebar with a yellow excavator sitting in the middle of it like it belonged there. Sarah came out onto the balcony with 2 coffees and asked what was wrong before I'd said a single word, because apparently my face told her everything. I turned the phone toward her, and she set both cups down on the railing so fast that one of them tipped over and she didn't even notice. We didn't speak for almost a full minute. We just stood there scrolling through Dale's photos, one after another, watching our house disappear in real time through someone else's camera lens 400 miles away. I called Dale immediately, and he picked up on the first ring, already talking before I could say hello. He said a demolition crew showed up around 8 that morning with what looked like full permits and an HOA authorization letter, that he'd tried to stop them, that he actually walked up to the foreman with his phone out recording, and the guy had shown him a stapled packet of paperwork with official-looking letterhead and told him this was a county-approved structural removal due to safety violations. Dale said the foreman seemed completely calm about it, like this was just another Tuesday job. He said by the time he realized something was deeply wrong, the crew had already taken down the east wing. I told Sarah to start packing while I called the police, and the non-emergency line connected me to a dispatcher who, after I explained what was happening, put me on hold for what felt like an hour but was probably 4 minutes. When she came back, she said units were already on scene and that the demolition company had documentation showing this was an authorized teardown tied to an HOA emergency abatement order. I asked her to repeat that. An emergency abatement order. I have spent 11 years working for the county handling exactly that kind of paperwork, and I knew immediately that something about this didn't add up, because an emergency abatement order on a residential structure of that size would have required documentation that simply did not exist for my house. There were no outstanding violations on my property. None. I would know. I'm the one who would have filed them. That's the part I haven't told you yet, and it's the part that changes everything about this story. I'm a county inspector. Zoning compliance, permitting investigations, environmental violations, grading, easements, right-of-way disputes, development inspections. That's my job. That's been my job for over a decade, and almost nobody in my neighborhood knows it. I keep my work life and my home life separate on purpose. When people ask what I do, I usually just say I work for the county in some vague capacity and let the conversation move on. I learned a long time ago that telling people you're an inspector changes how they treat you, and not always in a good way. So for 3 years, ever since Sarah and I built that house, my neighbors have known me as the quiet guy who waves from his truck and mows his own lawn. Most of them, including the woman who runs our HOA, have no idea that I spend my workdays inside county systems most homeowners don't even know exist. We got on the road within 40 minutes, and the 4-hour drive back felt like 4 days. Somewhere around hour 2, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and it turned out to be a reporter from a local news affiliate who'd apparently already gotten a tip about a dramatic HOA-ordered demolition in our community. I hung up without answering most of her questions, but one thing she said stuck with me the entire rest of the drive. She said her tip had come from someone inside the HOA itself, someone who wanted this story told a certain way before I even got home. That meant someone had been planning the narrative around this demo before the dust had even settled, literally. When we finally turned onto our street, I slowed the truck almost to a stop because for a second I genuinely didn't recognize where I was. Our 4-acre lot, the one with the long gravel drive and the oak trees Sarah had refused to let any builder touch, was just gone, flattened. What remained of the house looked like a controlled implosion, stone and broken glass and snapped support beams scattered across what used to be our front lawn. A small cluster of neighbors stood near the property line, filming with their phones, and standing slightly apart from them, arms crossed, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, was Linda Castellano, president of the Brookhaven Ridge Homeowners Association for the past 6 years, the woman who once fined a retired school teacher $400 for having the wrong shade of beige on her mailbox post. Linda didn't look nervous when she saw me get out of the truck. She looked satisfied. She walked toward me with the same confident, unhurried stride she used at every HOA meeting when she was about to announce a new fine schedule. And she said, almost gently, "I know this looks difficult, but the structure presented an ongoing hazard to the community, and the board had every legal right to act." I asked her what hazard. I asked her to show me the inspection report, the engineering assessment, the violation notice, anything. She said the documentation was being finalized and would be available through proper channels. I asked her who authorized the demolition crew, and she said the HOA's legal counsel had handled all of that, and that I would receive formal notice in due time. That phrase, in due time, is when I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a plan that had already accounted for my reaction. I spent that first night in a hotel room going through county systems on my laptop, the same systems I use every day for work, except this time I was searching my own address. There was no emergency abatement order on file. There was no structural hazard complaint. There was no inspection request tied to my property in the past 18 months. What I did find, buried in a permitting subfolder that took me almost 2 hours to locate, was a grading and demolition permit application submitted 9 days earlier, supposedly signed by me, authorizing removal of an unsafe accessory structure at my address. My signature was on it. It wasn't my signature. It was a passable forgery, good enough to fool a contractor glancing at a stapled packet, not good enough to fool the persons whose actual signature it was supposed to be. The demolition company turned out to be a small outfit out of a neighboring county, and when I called the owner directly the next morning, he sounded genuinely rattled once I explained who I was and what had actually happened. He said his foreman had been approached 3 weeks earlier by a woman claiming to represent the HOA on an urgent abatement matter, and that she'd provided what looked like a complete permit packet, along with a rush payment that covered expedited scheduling. He pulled up the file while we talked and read me the name on the payment authorization. It wasn't Linda's name. It was a name I didn't recognize at all. A name that, it would later turn out, belonged to a Shell LLC registered 4 months earlier, with an address that traced back to a strip mall mailbox service 2 counties away. That's when the first real complication of this whole mess hit me, because if Linda hadn't filed the fraudulent permit herself, and someone else had, then this wasn't just an HOA president throwing her weight around. This was something bigger, with more people involved and money behind it. I drove to the county permitting office myself the next morning, not as a homeowner this time, but flashing my own credentials, which got me a level of cooperation a regular resident filing a complaint never would have received. I asked to see the original submission metadata on the forged permit, and the clerk pulled up something that made my stomach turn. The application had been submitted through an internal portal account, one that belonged to Russ Whitfield, a senior planner in my own department. Russ and I had worked together for 6 years. Russ had been to my house for a barbecue. Russ had personally walked the lot survey with me when we were finalizing the build 3 years earlier. And now his login credentials had been used to push through a forged demolition authorization on my own home. I confronted him that same afternoon in the parking lot of our own building, and he didn't even try to deny using his account because apparently he assumed I'd never find out it was him specifically and not someone who'd stolen his login. He looked more annoyed than guilty, like I'd interrupted something. He told me almost defensively that Linda had approached him through a mutual contact months earlier, offering him a consulting position with a development firm she was working with, something called Ridgeline Confluence Partners, in exchange for smoothing over a few administrative items related to a planned road expansion through Brookhaven Ridge. He said he didn't know they'd actually go through with demolishing an occupied house. He said he thought it was just going to be paperwork that quietly expired without anyone noticing. That's when the real shape of this thing started to come into focus, and it was so much bigger than a petty HOA grudge. Ridgeline Confluence Partners, it turned out, had been quietly trying to secure a corridor through Brookhaven Ridge for almost 2 years, a stretch of land that would connect a new 600-home development to the county highway without having to negotiate an expensive easement through a competing landowner's property. My 4 acres sat directly in the middle of the most efficient route. Linda, according to county business filings I pulled that same week, had a financial relationship with Ridgeline that went back further than her HOA presidency. She held a small but real equity stake in the development company through her husband's consulting firm, something she'd never disclosed to a single homeowner in 6 years of collecting their dues and enforcing their fence height violations. I want to be honest about something here, because this story could have ended with me just exposing Linda and feeling vindicated, and maybe that would have been enough. But once I started pulling permitting records for the entire HOA, looking for any other irregularities tied to Russ's account or Linda's tenure, I found something I genuinely wasn't prepared for. The retaining wall behind the community pool, built 4 years earlier, had never received the required engineering sign-off, and a county geotechnical report I found from 18 months prior had flagged active soil movement behind it that nobody had acted on. The drainage system for the entire eastern section of the neighborhood, the section closest to the floodplain buffer, had been modified without permits during a beautification project that Linda herself had spearheaded, redirecting stormwater runoff in a way that put at least 11 homes at meaningfully increased flood risk. There were forged inspection sign-offs going back nearly 3 years on at least 6 separate projects, all routed through Russ's compromised credentials, or in 2 cases, through an account belonging to an inspector who'd retired and whose login had simply never been deactivated. My house being demolished, as devastating as it was, had accidentally kicked open a door into years of quietly accumulating misconduct that affected nearly every family in that neighborhood, and most of them had no idea any of it existed. The HOA board meeting 2 weeks later was supposed to be a routine quarterly session. It became something else entirely once word got out that I'd be attending with documentation. The community room was packed, more people than I'd ever seen at one of these meetings. Folding chairs lined against the back wall, people standing in the doorway. Linda opened the meeting like she always did, calm, composed, in control, talking about landscaping budgets like nothing was wrong, and I watched several board members exchange glances that told me they already suspected something was about to happen. When the floor opened for community concerns, I stood up and introduced myself the way I never had to most of these people. Not as the quiet guy on the corner lot, as a county inspector with 11 years in zoning and permitting compliance. And I told them I had documentation showing that the demolition of my home had been authorized using a forged permit, traced to a board-adjacent shell company, that this shell company was tied to a development firm with an undisclosed financial relationship to our HOA president, and that the same compromised credentials used to forge my permit had also been used to falsify inspection records on the retaining wall, the drainage modifications, and at least 4 other projects across the neighborhood going back 3 years. I laid it out piece by piece, deliberately, the way you build a case when you actually want people to absorb it, rather than just react to it. I showed the permit metadata. I showed the LLC registration. I showed the geotechnical report on the retaining wall that nobody had acted on. Each piece landed harder than the last, and I watched the room shift in real time. Watched neighbors who defended Linda for years start looking at each other instead of at me. Watched two board members start typing furiously into their phones, presumably to their own lawyers. Linda tried to interrupt twice, tried the same calm, authoritative tone she'd used on me at the demolition site. But it didn't work the same way in a room full of people who were realizing their own homes might be sitting on undisclosed structural risk because of decisions she'd made and hidden from them. The moment her composure actually broke was when I mentioned Ridgeline Confluence Partners by name and asked her directly, in front of everyone, whether she or her husband held any financial interest in that company. She started to answer with something vague about community partnerships, and someone in the crowd, a woman I recognized as a longtime resident named Pat Yuta, stood up and said loudly that she'd seen Linda's husband's name on Ridgeline's website as a strategic advisor months earlier and hadn't thought much of it at the time. The room erupted into overlapping conversation, and Linda just stood there for a few seconds, sunglasses long gone, looking for the first time since I'd known her like she didn't have a script ready. What happened over the following months was less dramatic than a courtroom scene, but more thorough in its consequences. Linda was removed from the HOA board within 3 weeks, voted out in an emergency session that drew nearly 90% resident turnout. The county opened a formal fraud investigation into the forged permits, and Russ resigned before he could be terminated, cooperating with investigators in exchange for what his lawyer hoped would be leniency, given that he hadn't personally profited beyond a job offer that never materialized once Ridgeline's dealings became public. Ridgeline Confluence Partners quietly withdrew their proposed road corridor application once county planning flagged the entire project for review, and the development that would have run through my property never broke ground. I filed civil claims against the demolition company, who in turn filed their own claims against the Shell LLC that had paid them, which led investigators to 2 other names connected to Ridgeline who were also facing scrutiny for similar maneuvers in a different county entirely. Sarah and I didn't move back into a rebuilt house for almost 14 months. The insurance fight alone took half that time because our policy hadn't anticipated covering a demolition authorized by forged government paperwork, and it took depositions and a small mountain of documentation before they agreed it wasn't something we had any ability to prevent. We rebuilt smaller than before, honestly, not because we couldn't afford the same footprint again, but because something about replicating the exact house that had been torn down while we sat on a beach 400 miles away felt less like healing and more like pretending nothing had happened. The new house has the same stone from the same quarry near Marble Falls, but the floor plan is different, more ours, built with the strange clarity that comes from losing something and having to decide what actually mattered enough to rebuild. What I think about most, looking back, isn't the satisfaction of watching Linda's composure crack in that community room, even though I won't pretend that didn't feel like something. It's how completely her own arrogance did what no investigation or lawsuit ever could have managed on its own. She assumed I was just another homeowner she could maneuver around, because for 3 years that's all she'd ever bothered to find out about me. She built an entire scheme on the assumption that the quiet man on the corner lot had no way of understanding what was happening to him. And that single wrong assumption is what unraveled everything she'd spent years building. We lost a house. We lost over a year of normal life. But she lost something she could never forge a permit to get back. The years of trust an entire neighborhood had placed in her, spent the moment she decided I was someone she didn't need to actually know.